Hi, I'm Grant Hogue, and this is the Scoliosis Dialogues, the official podcast of the Scoliosis Research Society. I'm here today with Jim Sanders, and we're discussing his new paper, Human Spinal Height Growth, a description of normal spine growth patterns and adult spine height prediction from a longitudinal cohort. This paper is published in the newest edition of our official journal, Spine Deformity. Dr. Sanders is the chair of the Department of Orthopedic Surgery at the University of North Carolina and the Frank C. Wilson Distinguished Professor of Orthopedic Surgery at the same institution. He's a long-standing member of the Scoliosis Research Society, and we really all owe him a debt of gratitude for his work on human growth and maturation, particularly the Sanders classification system, which many of us use daily in our clinical as well as research endeavors. So, Dr. Sanders, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Grant, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
So, just to get us started, for anyone amongst the viewers or the listeners who haven't read the most recent Spine Deformity Journal, could you give us a summary of your paper and your findings?
Sure. So, just a brief thing. This is from a longitudinal cohort of children who were followed in Cleveland. They actually became the basis for the Gorilla Compile Atlas, which everyone's used to using at least many times throughout their days often. And they collected a large group of children, followed them longitudinally. It's the largest existent study of normal human growth that's around. And so we were able to, from that study, to be able to take the body measurements that they had in conjunction with measurements that we made from various radiographs and determine how the spine was growing over time. And we ended up using the multiplier method, which works quite well, not with age so much, but when you compare it to the timing of the peak height velocity. And so what we were able to do is to be able to identify the multipliers for spine growth based upon their timing relative to the peak height velocity.
And so, in the paper, there are three different methods that you use to kind of ascertain height or length. And you go into a great amount of detail about how you build confidence in these methods. So method three seemed to be the one with the highest confidence. So can you take us through the three different methods and why method three had the highest confidence?
Sure. Well, we're trying to deal with semi-messy data. I mean, it was very carefully collected when they did it. And so you can use the data, but when you start trying to correlate body measurements with radiographic measurements, it becomes tough. And so we did the best as we were looking through this. We looked at the first method was really looking at T1 height to compared to S1 height. The problem is the T1 height is measured on a shoulder radiograph, and they were getting radiographs routinely as the kids were growing of their left shoulder, and that included typically the sternoclavicular joint and T1. Not quite so consistent because all you need is a little bit of radiographic variation in terms of how that was made to have a difference in the height of T1. And so when you look at the plots that we have, that had the most scatter of all of them. The second method that we used was using up to the top of using the skull height, which was pretty consistent. They were very, very accurate in terms of the skull lengths, and so we were able to get good radiographs on that. The problem for that method was that during 1941 and 1942, which was toward the end of the study, and during World War II, the person who started this, which was Todd, everybody knows about the Todd collection, died. So he was no longer running the study, and other people were doing it. And they changed the method of measuring to the hip. And once they changed the measurement to method to the hip, that radiograph no longer became consistent. So the S1 height difference changed when we were comparing those. So it still did better than the T1. The best method of all in terms of real consistency was when we used a percentage of the body height, which is also termed the stem height, or the distance from the buttocks to the top of the head. And so when we use that method, fortunately, the ratios of things don't change very much over time as kids are growing through the adolescent growth spurt, which is when this matters. And so that method ended up being the most consistent overall. And All of them were very consistent with what John Emmons came up with previously with the pelvic, looking at the pelvic inlet width and comparing that to the length of the spine. All of the methods were quite consistent with that, but that one ended up being slightly the most consistent. So it became a quite good method of being able to look at the multipliers.
Is there a way kind of for the future to compare or even use this hand in hand with your previous research, like the Sanders classification? Is it something where we can match these two up in a meaningful way?
Yes, we did that somewhat in a previous article looking at height, which was published in scientific reviews. And so we are working currently on trying to create some box plots looking at various skeletal maturity stages compared to spine height. You don't have to stick with the Sanders score. You can use other scores which work well too. So we're in the process of creating the box plots that relate that to the multipliers for the spine for all the SRS members, but also to extremity and for height overall.
For this data, what do you see kind of in the immediate and maybe in the future too, as far as clinical applications?
I think there's really two major applications for it. The first is I think it probably has applicability to people who are doing spinal tethering. Can you predict the growth that's going to happen in the spine with tethering? It has to be applied to that. It hasn't been done yet, but I think it would be a good place to go. And if it works, then it could probably provide the people who are tethering a better prediction on when I should be doing a tether if I'm going to assume there's no growth occurring on the convex side. The second is to decide when should I be doing a fusion on a child who is growing? How much growth do they have of their spine overall? And if I fuse them now, where are they going to be? So I think those are the two areas currently that it's going to have the most applicability.
Fantastic. So in your limitation section, you are very honest about the limitations of the data set and things that you had mentioned before. But one of them is that it is a very homogeneous data set.
Mhm.
It is a very white middle class data set starting from the 30s. And so with historical data sets in general, how can researchers create more generalizable results?
I think the generalizable results are not going to occur from other longitudinal series. They're going to be impossible to reproduce unless you're using ultrasound or some other method. I think it's going to become from the things that I mentioned to you here. What happens if you use it for a tether? What happens if you use it for spinal growth? Does it predict them accurately in the children that we're seeing now? We found that we've had the same questions that came up when we're looking at the hand stages. And yet we have found that the hand stages are very applicable to children around the world, regardless of their race or their ethnicity. So I think that it's probably going to be widely generalizable, but it has to be tested in that way.
Yeah. So you just mentioned how it would be impossible or nearly impossible to recreate data sets like this because they're based off of radiation exposure.
Correct.
So with newer technology, rather slot scanning technology, or even kind of non-radiating body scanning technologies that really everybody is getting into now, do you think that those could be repurposed for prospective data collection of growth like this?
Absolutely. And that would be great. Give us much more information. I think the studies that they did were the best that could potentially be done at the time. But I think we have better methods now that can minimize the risk to growing children. Radiation will still be a concern, even with the slot scanner, even though it's small. I think radiation will still be a concern. But if you could do really fast MRIs, ultrasound, or some other modality that doesn't involve radiation and it's safe, yeah, there'll be big, expensive studies, but they could certainly be done.
Yeah, excellent. So, any parting thoughts on this data or where you're headed next with it?
Well, I think right now the big question is, can we apply this clinically? And I think that's the next stage for this data is to apply it clinically, see if it's actually giving the predictions that help people to figure this stuff out. That's why it's in the Spine Deformity Journal for people to take out and use.
Dr. Sanders, we want to thank you again for joining us on the Scoliosis Dialogues. Thank you for talking about this paper. It really, I think, piques the interest for everyone who is treating growing patients with scoliosis. I look forward to seeing hopefully you and many of our colleagues at IMAST in Glasgow, Scotland in just a few weeks. And I would remind everyone else to be on the lookout for registration and hotel information for our 60th annual meeting of the Scoliosis Research Society this September in Charlotte, North Carolina, not too far away from you.
Yeah, well, welcome everyone to our beautiful state.
Excellent. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.